It's a great honor for me to introduce the laureate in mathematics, which is Claire Voisin, who is the CNRS research director at the Institut de Mathématiques de Jussieu, Rive Gauche, I suppose, for outstanding contributions to complex and algebraic geometry, including Hodge theory, algebraic cycles, and hyperkähler geometry. Now, I'm not an algebraic geometer myself, so I had some help by a colleague, David Reed, to compile this presentation. First, a very short CV. The laureate was born in Paris, studied in Paris at École Normale Supérieure, and took the PhD at Orsay in Paris. And from the beginning, been a researcher at the CNRS, which is the French Research Council, so to say. And was a professor at Collège de France for 5 years, and currently at Sorbonne Jussieu University. She has 129 publications, maybe 130 soon. No, more than 3,000 citations. She got many prizes before, the European Math Society Prize in 1992 already, Clay Research Award, the CNRS Gold Medal. It's amazing that the Research Council in France gives out medals. I would like to see that in Sweden. And the gold medal is won every year, and it's usually for all science. So I just look at it every about 10, 12 years, it goes to a mathematician. The Shaw Prize and BBVA Frontiers of Knowledge Award. Actually, this year was not handed out yet, maybe. And the Crawford Prize, of course. And many others. Now, what is algebraic geometry? This is, of course, mostly for non-mathematicians. It is the geometry of solutions to polynomial equations. And we have one, a favorite, x2 plus x squared plus y squared is equal to 1. That, is the equation for a circle. But that is only real solutions. If you look at the complex solutions, you get called a Riemann sphere, and this one doesn't rotate, so just And as you can see, well, the circle has a hole, but you don't understand until you look at the complex, into the complex, has no hole. No, algebraic geometry is like dentists. They look for hole on surfaces. And that's called genus 0. Well, it's usually not a genus to think about, but... And this is quadratic equation. Then we have a quartic equation. You take the real solutions, you have two ellipsoid-looking solutions on the real. And that corresponds to a torus, a donut for Americans, which is one hole. That's called genus 1. And you can find surfaces with 2, 3, 4, 5 holes, and so on. And this is a very old subject, algebraic geometry. It started in the antiques, it continued in Middle Age. Famous poet and mathematician Omar Khayyam said in the 11th century, do not pay attention to the fact that algebra and geometry are different in appearance. You should never think about appearance. Okay, so let's go to higher dimensions. Holes are just the starting grounds for surfaces. In higher dimensions, algebra and topology becomes complicated. Well, more complicated, you should say. Usually things get more complicated in higher dimensions. I think there are some things that get easier, but mostly complicated. And genus is replaced by Hodge numbers. And you can see these Hodge numbers here in these numbers here within the rhomboid. It's called, let me see. You see the 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, and so on. These are the Hodge numbers of the quintic Calabi-Yau threefold. So they're kind of generalized holes. Holes in, I don't know, maybe in different dimensions. And this is, on the left, you see the quintic Calabi-Yau threefold, which is given by this fifth order equation. That's why it's called quintic. And it's threefold because it's three-dimensional, but it's three complex dimensions. So for us, it's 6 dimensions. So you cannot see it. You have to cut out a slice in 3 dimensions, then cut it out so you can see part of it, I suppose. And the Hodge conjecture is one of the most, the 7 millennium problems given in 2000 by the Clay Research Institute. And if you solve it, you get $1 million. One is solved, but the 6 one are left, and Hodge is one of them. It is about the interplay between geometry and topology, and is at the core of the laureate's research interest. And the conjecture was, on a complex projective manifold, every Hodge class is algebraic. What complex means is it's like this saw. It consists the manifolds are handled by complex numbers. They are discrete also objects too. The interpretation is that Hodge numbers on the vertical symmetry line arises from geometrical objects, some manifolds. And the vertical symmetry line is the 1, 1, 1, 1, going from top to the bottom in this case. So 1, 1, 1, 1. This is still a wide open conjecture, but Laureate is one of the few mathematicians who managed to give significant contributions. But her research interests are manifold. Algebraic geometry, here you see cases of integral Hodge conjecture, Shao rings, Lurel's problem, and so on. Complex geometry, there is a negative answer to Kodaira's problem, counterexamples to a variance of Hodge conjecture. I think if you try to extend Hodge conjecture to a wider class, it's not possible. Simplectic geometry with mirror symmetry, and differential geometry, and algebra. This one is called Syzygy, for Green's Syzygy conjecture. To sum it up, the laureate is the leading researcher in Hodge theory throughout her career. She had made new and original contributions to very difficult problems, constantly pushes the exploration of algebraic varieties in original and new frontiers. Directions. Direction gives a frontier. Makes use of both algebraic and analytic viewpoints, geometry, algebra. But there is also a kind of, you use analytic means you use function theory also. And to cite a colleague of the laureate, Olivier Debar, Hodge theory is Claire's playground. Do you agree? Now, if you work with CNRS, you don't have to teach, but Voisin has contributed with 2 volumes on Hodge theory to introduce new generations of mathematicians to the subject of Hodge theory. So now I welcome the laureates to the stage here to give a speech. Okay.
So, yes, thank you for this beautiful introduction. I would like to start thanking the Crafoord Foundation and the Crafoord family for supporting not only science, but more specifically mathematics. When I see the list of domains that are supported, I see that some are obvious. But when you say that you want to support mathematics, it's something that for me, it's a sort of philosophical step, that shows some faith in human knowledge. So I really appreciate that. Of course, I am also very grateful personally. So my talk will be much more elementary than the introduction that was made here. So I will start with Yes, some sort of a warm up in the historical relationship between the theory of numbers and geometry. So the numbers we have the integers, of course, 0, 1, etc., and also the negative 1. And they form, the structure they have is that of a commutative ring. That means that you do all the operations that you know, addition, subtraction, and subtraction is why I put the negative numbers, and multiplication. And commutative here, that means that the product A times B is the same as B times A. And next, you have the rational numbers, where you consider the ratios P over Q of two integers, where Q, of course, the denominator should be non-zero. And the structure they have now is that of a commutative field, with the definition that is written here, that a commutative field, it is a commutative ring in the previous sense, plus the condition that a non-zero element has an inverse. So that's why I added the 1 over q, the integer, so you do not have the inverse. Okay, and some historical steps in our understanding of numbers. What I find interesting is that these historical steps, they were more or less forced by geometry. Of course, there is the famous statement that one can learn at school, that the square root of 2 is irrational. That goes back to Greek mathematics. What is interesting in that statement is the fact that this number, square root of 2, it has a geometric significance. Thanks to the Pythagoras theorem, it is the length of the diagonal of a square of edge length 1. Now, the square root of 2, it is not a rational number. However, it is not very far from being rational because it is a so-called an algebraic number. Namely, it satisfies a polynomial equation. This polynomial equation, x squared equal 2, and this is a polynomial equation with rational coefficients. That is what we call algebraic numbers. And there is something to prove. Not very hard. The algebraic numbers, they form a field that is bigger than the field of rational numbers. And the next very important step, again imposed on us by geometry, was the discovery, the proof by Lindemann in 1882, that P is a transcendental number. So unlike square root of 2, it does not satisfy a polynomial equation with rational coefficient. So I must say that before that, the existence of a transcendental number was known. Some numbers, transcendental numbers, were constructed by Liouville. But P is particularly interesting because it is imposed on us by geometry. Because, of course, 2p is a circumference of a circle of radius 1, so it has a geometric significance. And in the history of of our understanding of real numbers, what comes next and much later is rigorous foundations on analysis over the real numbers. And there's a axiomatic definition and their topological properties, and essentially that goes back to Weierstrass and Cauchy. Okay, so that was all for real numbers, and now my talk will be mainly about complex numbers, which I like very much. Of course, I think all of you know what is a complex number. We start with the observation that if you have a real number A, its square is a positive number. And that means that the equation x2 equal -1 has no real solution. And the complex numbers, they come as I can consider this is an extraordinary invention for different reasons. So an extraordinary invention because what we do when constructing complex numbers, we say, well, the square root of -1 cannot exist. We could just stop here and say, that's it, that's finished. But no, we don't do that. We say that does not exist in the world of real numbers, but we are just going to create it in another set of numbers, and that will be the complex numbers. So the complex numbers, you introduce a letter I, which will be precisely the solution of I square equal -1, and then the next step is to understand how we can consider the so-called complex numbers, namely the expressions a plus ai plus b with a and b real numbers as numbers. We consider them as numbers simply because we have over them exactly the same operations that we know that we have for the real numbers, for the rational numbers, etc. We can add them. The formula is here, and we can multiply them. We just multiply them by applying the general rules that we know in algebra, the axioms of commutative rings. And when doing this development, when we meet I square, we replace it by -1, we regroup, and that gives us the formula for the product of two real numbers. And the product of two complex numbers. Now, the first property of the field of complex numbers is that this is a field. As I said, a field, that means that you are able to invert the non-zero element, and the existence of inverse. It comes from the complex norm. If you have a non-zero complex number, its complex norm, of course, by the square norm, I should say. So Z is a plus ib, it's a square norm, it's a square plus b square, and it is formal to write it as a product, a plus ib times a minus ib, and this is a product of z by the complex conjugate z bar. And that formula gives us, when z is non-zero, the square norm is non-zero, and we finally get a formula for the inverse. So the field, so we have a field, a commutative field of complex numbers. And next come the so-called fundamental theorem of algebra, which is a funny expression, I mean, a funny situation, because of course it's the theorem looks algebraic, but in fact the proof it's necessarily, in fact, a proof of an analytic nature. So the statement says that if you have a polynomial p of z, of degree d, with complex coefficients, it has exactly a d root in C, and equivalently, that means that you can factor your polynomial here. I normalized it with the top coefficient to be 1. Your P is a product of d linear term, and the roots are, of course, z1 to zd. Well, I just say a word about the proof. You see immediately that this theorem, that any polynomial of degree d splits into the product of d terms, is equivalent to a weaker statement that any polynomial of a strictly positive degree has at least one root, in one complex root, and the equivalent is by induction on the degree, because if you know that there is one root, say z1, then you do Euclidean division of polynomials, and you conclude that your polynomial can be written as z minus z1 times a polynomial of a smaller degree, and by induction on the degree, you finally get all the roots. And I said that the proof of this theorem, of this d'Alembert theorem, is analytic, and indeed it uses some topological and analytic arguments. We want to prove that a polynomial which is not constant, that is a strictly positive degree, has at least 1 0 in C, and the proof is by contradiction. You have your polynomial P. You assume that it has no 0, and then you consider the function 1 over the norm of P. Because the norm of P does not vanish anywhere, this function will be continuous. But now you look at your polynomial, it's very obvious that at infinity, the norm of P of Z tends to infinity. So when you do the norm of 1 over P, it's a function which is 0 at infinity. And now there is the principle of extremal values, the theorem of extremal values that says that if you have this function that vanishes at infinity, it is positive, it is going to achieve to reach a maximum. And this is here that there is some analysis that we have over R, and that's a serious point. And then the end of the proof is to show that it's a local step to show that a function like that cannot reach a local maximum. So this is of a different nature. Okay, so another way to say this is to say that the field C of complex numbers is algebraically closed, or another way to state it is that if you consider any bigger commutative field, L, which contains C, and which is finite dimensional as a complex vector space over C, then it is equal to C. Well, I wrote a proof, but maybe I am not going to explain it. So, in some sense, C, you cannot construct a bigger field, except for transcendental extensions. And now, what I want to explain that still there is some interesting algebraic structure, which is now C is 2-dimensional over R, and there exists a non-commutative field, which is 4-dimensional over R, and which contains, in fact, many copies of C. So this is the field of quaternion. So how is it constructed? So I introduce 3 letters I, J, and K, and I will consider a 4-dimensional real vector space with a basis 1, I, J, and K. So the 1 is one of the real numbers, and that will be the one of our field. So a quaternion, that will be a combination of these 4 letters, so I don't write the 1. So a quaternion, this will be alpha plus beta I plus gamma J plus delta K, where alpha, beta, gamma, delta are real numbers. Now, of course, I give me the multiplication rules between these letters. And they are written here. I just write I square equal J square equal K square equal minus 1. And then there is another condition, Ig equal minus Ji equal K. And all the other rules will be deduced by the so-called associativity principle. For example, if you want to compute Ik, you write K equal Ig, you multiply on the left by I, and then you get an I square, which is a minus 1, and that will produce minus G. So from these rules here, you get all the multiplications between your letters. And then, once we have the multiplication between the letters, we compute the product of 2 quaternions by the formal rules of algebra. You know, you expand, you use distributivities, etc., associativities, things like that. Okay, so and now the remark, of course, that this is not commutative. I said commutative, that means that A times B is the same thing as B times A, but here it's not the case, because you see already I times G is minus J times I, so it's not commutative, so there is no contradiction. But the fact is that H is a field, not commutative, in the sense that any non-zero quaternion has an inverse. So maybe I can give an idea of the proof. Inside this four-dimensional space of quaternions, there is a three-dimensional space of pure quaternions, I, which is generated by I, G, and K. And now there is the quaternionic norm for which the 1 IGK is an orthonormal basis. And it's an easy lemma using these multiplication rules that if you consider a pure quaternion of norm 1, then its square is equal to -1. So a pure quaternion Z of norm 1 satisfies Z square equal -1. And then out of this, you easily construct an inverse, because suppose you have a Z which is non-zero. If it is real, of course, it will have an inverse. We are in R. If it is not real, you consider the two-dimensional vector space generated by 1 and Z. You call it LZ. It is going to meet the three-dimensional vector space of pure quaternions. And so it will contain one quaternion of a square -1 by the lemma. And then that means that this LZ, it is a copy of C, and you have inverse exactly as I said for C. Okay. Okay, so to show you that maybe numbers are not only the real numbers, but they are also numbers more generally. They are objects that satisfy algebraic, that have some structure. So now I come back. I said the complex number is an extraordinary invention because I consider they have extraordinary properties. And one of their extraordinary properties is that you can do what is called complex analysis, this analysis over the complex numbers. And what does that mean? You see, you said as this is a two-dimensional real vector space, so you can see it as R square. And so you can consider differentiable maps from an open set of C to C. Okay, so F from a U to C. And we say that this function, it will have a differential at any point. The differential is a linear map from R2 to R2, but R2 it is the same as C. And the definition of a holomorphic function is that this linear map at any point, it is a complex linear. That is, it is given by the multiplication by one complex number that we call the derivative of f at this point. Said like this, the definition looks simple, but that means, in fact, that this function that satisfy a certain linear partial differential equation that are called the Cauchy-Riemann equations. A typical example of a holomorphic function is given by a polynomial function. If you call f of z, which is given by a polynomial expression, alpha d z to the d plus plus, etc. This map, of course, is from C to C. Of course, it is of a C-infinite class, but in fact, if you compute the differential, it is very easy to see that it is holomorphic in the previous sense, and the derivative, that is this complex number, that the multiplication by which gives the differential, it is simply the formal derivatives of the polynomial. We know how to differentiate polynomials in the real setting. This is just the derivative of z to the d is d times z to the d minus 1, etc., etc. And it's quite easy to check that a polynomial function is holomorphic in the previous sense, and its the differential, it is given by the formal differential of the polynomial. And what comes next is that in fact I have almost exhausted all the holomorphic functions. It's not exactly true. A theorem that I attribute to Cauchy, I think that because it's a consequence of the Cauchy formula, for example, is that conversely, all the holomorphic functions, they are locally analytic function of the complex variable z. And what is an analytic function of the complex variable z? It's analytic. That means that the function is the uniform limit of its Taylor expansion. But furthermore, the Taylor expansion is given by polynomials in the complex variables. You see, if you take the Taylor expansion of a function of two variables, that should be given by polynomials in the two variables x and y, the real part and the imaginary part. But here, it's actually, if you do the Taylor expansion, you get polynomials in the complex variable z. Okay, so finally, we can do analysis, and analysis is just finally doing working with these holomorphic functions, which are locally complex analytic in the complex variable. And there is also this miracle of the complex numbers that solves all the problems that we want in trigonometry, namely the existence of the complex exponential, which is just given by this series exactly in the real setting. This series is uniformly convergent with infinite radius of convergence, and then it is a formal that is satisfied this property that the exponential a plus b is exponential a times exponential b. So that's simply wonderful. That is saying that the exponential it exchanges the additive structure on C and the multiplicative structure on C star, C minus 0. And as a corollary, we see, as an immediate corollary of this formula, we see that the exponential of z is never 0. That shows you that when we work with polynomials, we have said if we have a polynomial of positive degree, it will have a 0. But here, this is an example of a holomorphic function that is globally defined and has no 0 on C. So the holomorphic functions, they are definitely more complicated. And I want to mention that the complex analysis, even in one variable, has been extremely active in the 19th century. And Mittag-Leffler did a beautiful work on that, constructing meromorphic functions, so there are holomorphic functions with poles, that is some singularities. Okay, so that was all that I wanted to say about numbers. And now, up to now, I have not been saying much about what is geometry. And for me, what is geometry? It's also asking what is a space. And there is one answer, which is, for me, it's a philosophical question, what is space? And there is one first answer, which is due to Descartes, namely, and that relates geometry and numbers, namely using coordinates. A point in space can be simply described by a number by a sequence of numbers, which are the Cartesian coordinates. This is one aspect, but in fact, the point is that there are many very interesting spaces that cannot be completely described by coordinates. So typically, on the sphere, you cannot have a global system of coordinates that will identify any point with a number of sequence of real numbers. And so now, rather late, I think, really in the 20th century, the mathematicians came with the notion of a manifold. So it is a way of describing, I mean, of understanding the space. I think that could be, that is certainly useful also in physics and maybe also in astronomy, because we have been discussing spheres and spheroids, but nobody proposed that maybe the surface of a planet could look like this, which is really not obtained by deforming a sphere. So what is the idea of a manifold? Imagine the idea is that we cannot have a global understanding, global description, global knowledge of our space by a single chart. But we have this locally. So our space, it will be described by an atlas. That is the atlas, it is made of charts. The charts that describe locally our space. So in a chart, exactly as in geography, in a chart you have local coordinates. And the chart, well, technically it is covering an open set of the manifold. Now, when you have a chart coordinate, you do as before, analysis, you have numbers, etc. But the novelty is that to understand globally our space, we have to know, it's very simple, how the charts overlap. How you pass from one chart to another one. So this is a puzzle. Imagine you cannot understand globally your space by a single picture. You have your set of charts, and you have to glue. To know how to glue the charts together, and the information that you get in the gluing, it is what will give now information of really purely geometric nature. So there are two aspects. One aspect is the topology. The topology, I am going to insist on that. For the topology, essentially, we need to understand the combinatorics of the gluing of the chart. So it is something which is rather set theoretic. Another aspect of the importance of knowing how the various charts overlap is that this is what will give you, what will explain you, what will tell you what kind of global structure exists on your space. And I give one example, which is my favorite example because they are the objects I work on, which is the notion of a complex manifold. So a complex manifold, it is a manifold, except that we selected an atlas of charts. Now the charts, the local coordinates, they are given by a sequence of complex numbers instead of real numbers. And the key point which make all this coherent is that the gluing maps that allow to pass from one set of local holomorphic coordinates to another set of local holomorphic coordinates. There's a thing that there's a phi 1, 2 here. In this definition, they have to be holomorphic. And this is what will make the coherence of the definition, and that will make me say, I have a global complex structure on my manifold. So I think this is maybe a very important notion, but almost a philosophical one in mathematics, maybe a bit abstract, but very important in any case. I wanted to come back a little on topology. It's always the same picture, but it's not very important. I mean, this picture is just a sort of to fix ideas. It's a symbolic picture. So technically, this is called a genus 2 compact. I should not say Riemann surface because here the metric is not very important. It's really the topology that is important. And when you look at this object, you feel that it is different from a sphere. And why it is different from a sphere? It's because you have these red circles. I am claiming that the red circles which are on the left. The red circle, which is on the middle, it is clearly the boundary of a whole region. Because if I cut, you see, I cut this the red circle at the middle, I see that the whole area, region on the left, will be separated from the region on the right. So the red circle on the middle, it is the boundary of a whole region. But that is not true of the red circles on the left. If you cut, I claim that the red circle on the left, they are not the boundary of a region of an area in my surface. Why? Because if they were the boundary of a certain region in my surface, when I would cut along this circle, that means that this area will be separated from the rest. But this is not going to happen if you cut your surface along this top red circle. The surface will remain in only one piece. That shows you that the circle is not a boundary. So here you see that we found a phenomenon which is of a topological nature, and there have been in the beginning of 20th century, and maybe the whole 20th century was focused on that, the development of tools allowing to compute this topological phenomenon that we met with, and typically the cohomology. So there was maybe the Betti cohomology, first maybe introduced by Poincaré with integral coefficient. The de Rham cohomology with rational coefficient, introduced by de Rham. Finally, there are some comparison results, etc. These species, they measure the fact that there are, so here for HK, they correspond to the fact that there are codimension K, maybe oriented submanifolds of your space that are not boundaries of larger, of submanifolds of dimension 1 more. Okay, so. And so that means that finally our species, our manifolds, they come equipped with invariants that can be summarized by numbers. So you had mentioned the Hodge numbers, but before the Hodge numbers, there are the Betti numbers, there are the dimension of this cohomology species. For example, the Riemann surface of genus 2, the first Betti number is 4. It is the rank of this abelian group. So cohomology has very nice properties. It has a cup product. It has integration. And so that provides more and more information on the topology. And I finish with one slide coming back to differential geometry on manifolds. I wanted to say explain what is a hyperkähler manifold and relate this to the quaternion instead of the complex numbers. When you have a manifold, there is a relation between geometry, differential geometry of a manifold, and linear geometry. And this relation, well, maybe it depends on the point. Associated at each point of the manifold, there is a vector space, which is simply the tangent space. The easiest way to see it is to think of it as the set of tangent, speed vectors or tangent vectors to trajectories, one-dimensional trajectories on the manifold passing through the point. And what we call a hyperkähler manifold, well, it's a rough definition. There will be compact manifold whose tangent space at any point is, in fact, equipped with an action of the field of quaternions. So it's if you like, vector space on the field of quaternions, but we ask much more because here it's said like this. It's not extremely restrictive. What we want is that, well, if you have this action of the quaternions on the tangent space at each point, as I said, the sphere of pure quaternions, it will parameterize complex structure on the tangent space at any point. And the condition is that for each element of the sphere of pure quaternions, this data, they produce a complex structure on the manifold. So the conclusion is that the manifold has a sphere S2 of a complex structure parameterized by the sphere of pure quaternions. And these varieties, they look at as very improbable objects, but in fact they exist. We know many of them, we know how they deform, and just finished with a classification results that I proved with my collaborators, Debar, Weibrecht, and Macri recently. Topological classification result for hyperkähler Fourfold under one rather minor restriction on the cohomology rings that I described before. These hyperkähler fourfolds, they have to be of a tape that we knew already, namely this K3 2. I stop here.